I was not sentenced in a chamber of judgment or beneath the gaze of a robed magistrate. There was no gallery, no accusation spoken aloud, no chance to protest or confess. My conscription happened in an annex corridor beneath an administratum intake hall, a place not meant for lingering, where the walls sweated with condensation and the lumen strips flickered like dying insects. I remember the smell most clearly: old paper, solvent, mildew, and the faint copper tang of blood that never quite washed out of imperial floors. That was where my labor designation died. The clerk sat behind a plasteel desk scarred with knife marks and wax drippings. He wore the grey of the lower burrus, threadbare and immaculate at the same time, his sleeves ink-stained to the elbows. His face was thin and expressionless, the kind of face shaped by decades of not caring. He did not ask my name. He did not need it. My identity had already been reduced to a string of characters on a parchment slate, a work rating calculated from productivity audits and disciplinary notations. He glanced at it once, lips moving as he tallied my remaining life expectancy, then reached for the stamp. The sound it made when it struck the parchment still echoes in my skull, a wet, final thud, as if something soft had been crushed. The ink was thick and dark, smelling of rotten chemicals, and it bled through the page to stain the desk beneath. With that mark, my previous assignment, Hab Maintenance, Tier 47, ceased to exist. In its place bloomed a new designation, longer, heavier, weighted with sigils of sanction and obligation. Corpse Retrieval Unit. I did not understand it fully then, only that it meant I was no longer going back to my block. Sign, the clerk said, already reaching for the next file. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, the voice of a man reciting scripture he had never believed in. I signed because my hands knew how to obey, because obedience had been beaten into me since childhood catechisms. My name looked small and fragile beneath the seal, like it was already fading. He nodded once, satisfied, and rang a bell to summon the quartermaster. They processed me quickly after that, as if speed might prevent the weight of it from settling. I was led through narrow corridors where devotional murals peeled from the walls, saints flaking away to expose bare concrete beneath. At each checkpoint, my new designation was checked and rechecked, the seals verified by auspex and human eyes alike. No one met my gaze. I began to understand that I had become something unpleasant to look at, a reminder of function rather than faith. The quartermaster was more talkative, though his words were rehearsed. He fitted me with a respirator whose straps were stiff with old sweat and something darker. The filter hissed when I breathed, a wet, rattling sound that reminded me of a dying animal. He handed me a flak coat next, its padding hardened by layers of dried fluids that no amount of scrubbing had removed. I could feel the crusted history of it against my skin, each stain a story I was not meant to hear. Last came the corpse, hook a length of metal curved and sharpened, its surface etched with devotional script praising duty, sacrifice, and reclamation. Treat it with respect, the quartermaster said, tapping the hook with a knuckle. It's sanctified. I wondered what kind of blessing required something so sharp. They gathered us in a holding bay afterward, a dozen of us standing beneath a flickering lumen while an overseer recited our purpose. He spoke of sacred duty and necessary work, of how every body recovered was a tithe repaid to the emperor. He told us that nothing was wasted in the Imperium, that even in death, citizens served. His voice echoed in the bay, amplified by speakers that crackled with static, and for a moment I almost believed him. Almost, but beneath the words, I felt something else taking root, a tightening in my chest, a sense of being sealed inside myself. I looked at the others, men and women of varying ages, all wearing the same ill-fitting gear, and saw the same hollow look in their eyes. We were not heroes. We were not even soldiers. We were a solution to a logistical problem, stamped and filed and forgotten. When they dismissed us, I tried to remember the sound of my Hab's ventilation fans, the rhythm of my old work shifts, the small comforts of routine. The memories slipped away like water through my fingers. Already, my world was shrinking, narrowing to the weight of the flak coat on my shoulders and the cold heft of the hook in my hand. The respirator hissed with every breath, and I wondered if it would ever come off again. As we were herded toward the transport, I caught my reflection in a polished section of wall plating. The mask obscured most of my face, the lenses dull and opaque, turning my eyes into something inhuman. For a moment, I did not recognize myself. That was when it happened, subtle and irreversible. Something inside me quietly locked shut. Not snapped, not shattered, just closed. Like a door sealed by order of the administratum. I did not cry. I did not shout or resist. I stepped onto the transport with the others, filed into a bench seat, and waited for the engines to start. Somewhere above us, the hive city groaned and shifted, indifferent to my reassignment. I whispered a prayer I barely remembered, more out of habit than faith, and felt the words dissolve in the stale air. My fate had been written in ink and seal, and there was no appeal left to make. They told us our first deployment would be controlled, which in the mouth of an imperial overseer means only that someone has already decided the cost is acceptable. The transport rattled through service tunnels beneath the hive, its wheels shrieking against rails warped by heat and age. The air inside was stale and warm, thick with the breath of too many bodies trapped behind recycled filters. Every so often the lumen strips overhead dimmed to a sickly red, and the Vox speaker mounted near the driver crackled with half prayers and rote codes that meant nothing to me. I sat with my corpse, hook across my knees like a penitent holding a relic, my gloved hands sweating inside stiff fabric that smelled faintly of antiseptic layered over old rot. When we emerged from the tunnel network, the world changed texture. The hive's underbelly always feels damp, but here the dampness was cooked into the air itself, an oily humidity clinging to the skin. Ahead of us rose the hab block, a slab of habitation towers fused together in a grotesque stagger, its outer walls blackened, as if the entire structure had been held over a flame. Smoke still curled from broken windows like the last exhalations of a dying thing. There were banners draped across one side, imperial aquilas and devotional slogans, but they had blistered and sagged in the heat. The paint cracked into a spiderweb of ash. The overseer stood up as the transport slowed and shouted over the engine noise. Fires declared economically irrelevant, he announced, reading from a data slate as if it were scripture. Structural integrity at 31%. Salvage operations authorized. You will recover all viable remains and record weights, quantities, and any identifying marks. You will not linger. You will not pray unless instructed. Quotas will be issued at end of shift. There was a pause after that, as if he expected gratitude. No one spoke. Our respirators hissed softly in the silence. We disembarked into a street that looked like it had been scraped clean by violence. Ash coated everything, plasteel rubble, shattered signage, the skeletal frames of market stalls. It rose in little clouds around our boots, clinging to the seams of our gear. I remember how the ash tasted when it slipped past my mask seal, bitter, chemical, laced with burnt plastic and something else that I didn't want to name. There were other workers in the distance, Munitorum loaders, salvage teams, moving like ants around the carcass of the hab block, but none came close to us. Corpse retrieval is a profession that repels even the desperate. They issued us entry tags and led us through the breach, where the block's lower levels had collapsed inward. The threshold was marked with a hastily nailed sign, UNFR OCPON BESEDSTHOEOHERCDHY. Someone had splashed sanctified oil beneath it, the smear still wet, shining like a bruise in the ash. Inside, the heat struck like a hand. Even after 3 days, the building held fire in its bones. The air was hotter than the street, thick with soot, and each breath through the respirator felt like dragging air through damp cloth. The lumen strips along the corridor were dead, so we worked by the thin beams of our helm, lamps, their light cutting tunnels through smoke. Shadows jumped at the edges of vision, twisting into shapes that looked too much like people, until you stepped closer and saw they were only melted furniture, hanging cables, collapsed ducting. I had expected bodies to be obvious. I had expected to see corpses laid out like the instructional picts in the administratum pamphlets, limbs intact, faces still human, death clean enough to process. Instead, the dead were fused to their surroundings as if the building had tried to swallow them. The first one I found was not even a whole body. It was a torso embedded in a wall of melted plasteel, ribs exposed like the frame of a collapsed umbrella. The flesh was swollen and slick, blistered into strange textures by heat. Flies droned somewhere in the darkness, fat and persistent, their wings making an obscene music against the quiet crackle of cooling metal. Hook them. The team lead rasped through his vox, voice distorted by the same cheap augmeter we all wore. Don't touch with hands if you can avoid it. Record the weight. My corpse, hook felt heavier when I raised it. The devotional script along its length caught my helm, lamps light in dull gleams. I slid the point beneath what was left of an arm and pulled. At first nothing moved, as if the body had become part of the wall. I braced my boot against the plasteel and pulled again, harder. The sound it made was not the sound of something lifting. It was the sound of something tearing that didn't want to tear, wet, resistant, intimate. When it finally came free, pieces remained behind, smeared across the wall like melted wax. I gagged, a reflex my respirator couldn't stop entirely. The taste of rotten burnt meat flooded my mouth, and for a moment my vision swam. I remember whispering the first litany then, not because I was instructed, but because my mind needed something familiar to cling to. Blessed be the Emperor's light. I muttered, the words barely audible beneath the respirator hiss. Blessed be the hands that serve. The prayer tasted like ash. We moved deeper into the hab block, through apartments turned into blackened cavities. Every room held signs of lives interrupted, half-melted toys, cooking implements warped by heat, devotional candles reduced to puddles of wax. The dead were everywhere, but rarely whole. Sometimes they were stacked near doors. Charred bodies collapsed together where they had tried to escape. Sometimes they were sprawled in corners, faces turned upward as if expecting mercy from a ceiling that had already fallen. The smell changed from room to room, sweet rot in one, acrid smoke in another. Chemical stench where storage tanks had ruptured. It pressed past my filters and settled in my throat, a sweetness that clung no matter how many times I swallowed. The work became a rhythm. Hook, pull, tear, dragged to the collection point. Mark the weight on a slate with shaking fingers. The slate's stylus kept slipping because my gloves were slick with fluids, and each time I fumbled, I felt the overseer's gaze like a blade at my back. He didn't need to shout. The Imperium's cruelty is often silent, expressed through expectation rather than violence, though violence is never far away. At some point I realized I had stopped looking at faces. I had stopped registering them as human. The bodies were obstacles, weights, numbers. If I let myself see them as people, I would have frozen in place and never moved again. So I focused on efficiency. I focused on the hook's placement, the leverage, the quickest way to free a corpse from collapsed debris. My mind turned itself into a machine, because that was the only way to survive the moment. We found a room where the heat had melted the floor into a glossy black pool that had hardened again. In that pool were shapes, bodies fused together, limbs tangled, faces pressed into each other like masks. The lead ordered us to separate them as best we could. I obeyed, because obedience is what I knew. Each pull with the hook made a sound like suction, and the fused bodies tore apart in slow, obscene strands. When a face finally peeled away from another face, the skin stretched and snapped, and I felt something deep inside me recoil. Keep moving. The lead said. You'll get used to it. I wanted to ask him if he ever truly had. But questions are a kind of resistance, and resistance is expensive. Hours passed without time meaning anything. The hab block's interior was a maze of collapsed corridors and burned-out stairwells, and my limbs grew heavy with fatigue. Sweat pooled beneath my flak coat, unable to evaporate properly under layers of grime. My respirator chafed the bridge of my nose raw. Each breath was work. Each step left ash prints that vanished under the next wave of falling soot. When we finally returned to the collection point, the bodies we'd recovered lay piled like broken cargo. The overseer stood beside them with his data slate, tapping weights and quantities, indifferent to the way fluids seeped out across the ground. A servitor, loader, trundled in, its augmetic arms whirring as it lifted corpses into a transport crate with mechanical tenderness that humans no longer possessed. The machine's optics never blinked. I wondered, briefly, if servitors ever smelled what we smelled, or if someone had mercifully removed that part of them. Shift complete. The overseer said at last, report to decontamination. Decontamination was a misnomer. It was a line of industrial showers that blasted us with freezing water and harsh chemical foam. The foam burned where it touched skin. We stood shoulder to shoulder, shivering in our gear, while the overseer watched from behind a plex barrier, making notes. The water ran black at first, then grey, then finally clear enough that it looked almost pure. Almost. When they dismissed us, I returned to the barracks assigned to the unit, a converted storage bay with rows of bunks, and a single lumen strip that never stopped flickering. My hands would not stop trembling. I removed my gloves and saw the skin beneath, pale and wrinkled from moisture, already chafed raw in places. I could still feel the bodies against my hook, still hear the tearing sound when flesh separated from melted wall. I went to the wash basin and scrubbed my gloves anyway. I scrubbed until the fabric began to fray, until the water in the basin turned cloudy with grime and something darker. When that wasn't enough, I scrubbed my hands, nails, wrists, forearms, anything that might still carry the memory of that place. The soap was harsh and grainy, smelling of lye. It did not remove the sweetness from my throat. It did not remove the sense that the dead were still clinging to me, not physically but in some deeper way. By the time I stopped, the skin beneath my nails was split and bleeding. The blood looked bright against the dull grey of the basin. I stared at it for a long time, strangely fascinated that I was still capable of bleeding, still technically alive. That night, when I lay on my bunk, the barracks stinking of damp gear and chemical cleanser, I closed my eyes and saw the melted faces again. I tried to pray. The words came out wrong, tangled with the sound of tearing flesh. I felt the same inner door from the day of my conscription pressed tighter, sealing me away from whatever softness remained. In the dark, I listened to the others breathe through their respirators, each hiss a reminder that we were all already half machines, trained to treat death as inventory. Outside, somewhere in the hive, the war or the riot or the accident or whatever the administratum called it continued. More fires would burn. More bodies would wait. And in the morning, we would be sent to collect them. By the third deployment, the work had stopped pretending to be exceptional. It was no longer framed as an emergency or a grim necessity. It was routine. Routine is where the Imperium hides its cruelest truths, because routine allows horror to be scheduled, measured, and punished when it underperforms. They issued the quotas at the start of shift, not the end. That was the change. We stood in formation in the barracks, while the overseer read from his data slate, his voice flat and precise, as though he were announcing ration allocations or maintenance cycles. Each unit was assigned a minimum recovery weight, measured in standardized mass units, not bodies. Bodies were inefficient as a metric. Bodies implied individuality, weight implied usefulness. Failure to meet quota, he recited, will result in disciplinary deductions, reassignment, or corrective action as deemed appropriate by administratum authority. He did not explain what corrective action meant. He never did. The Imperium prefers its threats abstract. Imagination does more damage than specificity. From that day on, numbers governed everything. How long we could spend in a collapse zone. How many retrieval teams were deployed to an area still under shelling. How many casualties were acceptable among us to retrieve the dead of others. The data slates never acknowledged danger, only delay. Structural collapse, hostile fire, environmental contamination, these were not excuses. They were inefficiencies. Supervisors accompanied us now, not to assist, but to observe. They walked a few paces behind, their boots always clean, their robes tucked carefully away from the filth. Each carried a data slate and a stylus, and their eyes flicked constantly between us and the numbers scrolling across their screens. They did not speak unless necessary. When they did, it was to note a lag in productivity or to issue a warning tone that carried no emotion, only consequence. The first time someone died beside me, it happened quietly. We were working the lower levels of a transit junction that had collapsed during an artillery exchange. The air was thick with dust and powdered stone, and every sound echoed strangely, distorted by the broken architecture. My team member, designation H-17, though I remembered his name once, was ahead of me, levering a body free from beneath a slab of ferrocrete. There was a groan, low and deep, like the building itself was clearing its throat. I remember opening my mouth to shout a warning. The ceiling came down before the sound could escape. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no scream, just a sudden, final impact that shook dust loose from every surface. When it settled, H-17 was gone. Where he had been was now a mound of rubble, broken rebar jutting out like exposed bones. A smear of red seeped slowly through the cracks, darkening the dust. I stood there, frozen, my corpse hook hanging uselessly at my side. My helm lamp trembled as my hands shook. For a moment, just a moment, I expected someone to shout, to call a halt, to order us back. That is what should happen when a worker dies. That is what happened in my old life, when accidents triggered investigations and prayers and apologies printed on cheap paper. The supervisor tapped his stylus against his data slate. Designation H-17, he said calmly. Status deceased. Update retrieval list. That was it. No pause, no prayer, no acknowledgement beyond the adjustment of a number. The weight we had lost by his death was noted, then added back to our quota in the form of his own remains. He had become cargo before the dust had finished settling. Continue, the supervisor added, and we did. Because stopping would have been refusal, and refusal is expensive, we worked around the rubble where H-17 had been, retrieving other bodies trapped nearby. Every so often, my hook scraped against something softer beneath the stone, and I knew I was touching him, or what was left of him. I did not look. Looking would have slowed me down. Slowing down would have been noted. By the end of the shift, H-17's identifier appeared on our slate, listed among the recoverables, estimated weight, condition compromised. I recorded it with the same hand I used to log everyone else. My handwriting did not change. That was when I understood fully what quotas meant. They were not targets to aim for. They were debts. If the dead of the battlefield did not provide enough weight, the Imperium would take it from us instead. The days blurred together after that. Each deployment came with a new set of numbers, each higher than the last. We were sent into zones still under intermittent fire, because the bodies there were fresh, which meant easier to process later. Shells fell while we worked, the concussive force rattling my teeth even through the mask. Sometimes limbs were shaken loose from half-buried corpses by the impact, rolling across the ground toward us like grotesque gifts. The supervisors did not flinch. They merely noted time lost to environmental interference. I learned to listen for the whistle of incoming rounds, to time my movements between impacts. Fear stopped feeling sharp and became something dull and constant, like a bruise you forget until you press on it. My heart no longer raced when shots cracked overhead. It simply tightened, conserving energy. One afternoon, a man from another unit was shot through the neck by stray fire while dragging a body across open ground. He fell without a sound, blood pumping rhythmically from the wound. We dragged him back behind cover, not to save him, but to prevent loss of recoverable material. He gurgled as we hooked him, his hands clawing weakly at our sleeves. The supervisor watched, expression unreadable. Efficient, he remarked, as we logged both weights together. That night, as I lay on my bunk, I tried to remember how it felt to be angry. The emotion surfaced briefly, a flicker of heat beneath layers of exhaustion, then faded. Anger required a belief that something could be different. Quotas erased that belief. Numbers are absolute. Numbers do not negotiate. I began to feel the weight of each corpse differently then. Not physically, I was already used to that, but psychologically. It was as if the dead resisted being moved, as if they understood that being reclaimed meant being erased completely. Sometimes my hook would catch, snagging on bone or twisted metal, and I would have to brace myself and pull harder. In those moments, I felt like I was engaged in a silent struggle, not just with mass and leverage, but with the dead themselves. At the processing point, the piles grew higher. Bodies from multiple units were stacked together, identities lost in the press of flesh. The servitors worked without pause, their augmetics wearing as they lifted, sorted, and loaded. Supervisors conferred over data slates, comparing totals, redistributing quotas like accountants balancing a ledger. Somewhere in their calculations, levs became decimals. I overheard one of them remark that retrieval efficiency had improved since casualties among retrieval units were factored into projected yield. He said it with approval, as if praising a well-oiled machine. I wondered if he realized what he was saying. I wondered if he cared. Sleep became shallow. I dreamed of numbers scrolling endlessly, of data slates that never stopped updating. Sometimes I dreamed I was being weighed, my own mass calculated and logged, my value determined by how much of me could be rendered useful. I woke with my hands clenched, nails biting into my palms, and forced myself to relax them. Injury reduced efficiency. By the end of the week, I no longer thought of myself as a worker. I was part of the quota. A mobile asset whose continued operation was preferable but not required. The inner door I had felt closing on the day of my conscription was now sealed tight, reinforced by layers of procedure and expectation. Whatever person I had been before was on the other side of it, unreachable. When the overseer announced the next deployment zone, closer to the front, higher projected yield, I felt nothing at all, no dread, no relief. Just the quiet acceptance of something inevitable. The numbers demanded it. The reclamation yards were where the lie of dignity finally collapsed. Up until then, the work had been framed, thinly, poorly, but still framed as recovery. We were told we were returning the fallen to the Imperium, that there was honor in ensuring no resource was wasted. On the battlefield, amidst smoke and shellfire, that fiction could almost survive. Almost. But the reclamation yards made honesty unavoidable. Nothing returned from there as it had arrived. The yards squatted on the outskirts of the hive like a complex of open wounds. Vast, roofless enclosures ringed by rusting gantries and conveyor lines, their surfaces slick with residue that never fully dried. Chimneys belched grey smoke that hung low in the air, mixing with the ever-present haze of the hive until the horizon dissolved into grime. The ground was a patchwork of stained plasteel plates, each one etched with grooves where fluids had flowed again and again, carving familiar paths like rivers in stone. We arrived at dawn cycle, though dawn meant nothing here. The light was the same sickly grey as always, filtered through layers of pollution and incense. Our transport backed up to an intake ramp, and the rear gate groaned open. The smell hit immediately, thick, layered, and overwhelming. Rot, chemicals, burnt flesh, machine oil, disinfectant. It bypassed the respirator's filters through sheer persistence, settling in the sinuses and behind the eyes. I tasted it with every breath. Unload. Came the order. Servitors waited at the base of the ramp, their bodies swollen with augmetics. Some had once been human-shaped. Others were little more than tracked platforms with arms bolted on. Their flesh was pallid and hairless where it showed, eyes replaced by optics that glowed faintly as they assessed incoming mass. They did not react to the sight of us or our cargo. They simply extended clamps and hooks and began to work. We dragged the bodies down the ramp, logging final weights as required. The data slate in my hand was slick with residue despite my gloves. Each entry required confirmation, mass, estimated composition, contamination level. I had learned the codes by rote: burned, crushed, ballistic trauma, mixed. The categories were endless, refined over centuries of practice. Death optimized. Beyond the intake point, the yard spread out into specialized zones. I saw bodies stripped of clothing by automated lines, garments shredded and fed into separate processors. I saw limbs severed cleanly by rotating blades, bones snapped and sorted by size. I saw vats where organs were dumped en masse. Their contents churned into a uniform slurry that would be refined into nutrient paste for lower-tier rations or processed further into industrial lubricants. Nothing was wasted. Everything was reduced. The noise was constant. Conveyor belts rattled. Crushers thundered. Steam vents hissed. Vox speakers droned litanies of efficiency and gratitude, praising the Emperor for the bounty provided by sacrifice. The words were distorted by interference, looping and overlapping until they became meaningless sound. Somewhere in the din, a warning klaxon sounded briefly, then cut off. The machinery never slowed. We were required to accompany our loads through the initial processing stages to ensure proper documentation. That meant walking alongside open conveyors where bodies moved past in segments. Heads rolled gently in shallow bins, their features slack and unremarkable in death. Torsos slid along steel rails, skin mottled and discolored. I caught glimpses of tattoos, scars, devotional brands, marks that once meant something to someone. Here, they were merely identifiers to be noted or ignored, depending on relevance. Once I recognized a scar. It was a crescent-shaped burn on a left forearm, just below where the elbow would have been if the arm was still attached. I had seen that scar up close, months ago, in a ration line. The man had joked about it, said it was from a manufacturing accident that earned him a day's rest and a lifetime of pain. I remembered the sound of his laugh. Surprised that such a thing could still exist, I looked away immediately. Recognition was dangerous. Recognition slowed the hand, lingered the eye. It invited questions the administratum had no patience for. I marked the weight and classification and moved on, my face hidden behind the respirator's dead lenses. The machine did not care that I knew him. The machine cared only that he fit. Clerks worked from raised booths overlooking the yard, separated from us by panes of thick plex. They wore cleaner robes, their hands ungloved as they tapped at consoles and stamped forms. Occasionally, one would lean out to call for clarification on a manifest discrepancy. Their voices were polite, even warm, but they never came down to the floor. They never smelled what we smelled. When they thanked us for our service, it sounded sincere, which somehow made it worse. The runoff channel ran through the center of the yard, a shallow trench designed to carry excess fluids away to filtration systems. It overflowed often. I stood ankle deep in it while signing a transfer form, the liquid warm against my boots. It soaked into the seams and stayed there, no matter how often I cleaned them. The clerks did not notice, or if they did, they did not care. After unloading, we were assigned secondary tasks, sorting misclassified remains, clearing jams where too much mass had clogged a processor, retrieving fragments that had fallen where they should not. One jam required us to reach into a crusher that had stalled on a dense cluster of bone and metal. The machine was powered down, but the heat radiating from it was intense. My gloves smoked faintly as I worked the blockage free, pulling out pieces that no longer resembled anything human. I placed them in the appropriate bin without thinking. That frightened me more than the gore ever had. At some point, I realized I was envying the dead, not in a dramatic, suicidal way. Such thoughts were inefficient, but in a quiet, practical sense. They were finished. Their purpose was complete. They had been reduced to components and moved on. I, on the other hand, remained in a state of constant anticipation, my value dependent on continued function. The dead did not have quotas. When the final forms were signed and our presence was no longer required, we were dismissed with a brief blessing broadcast over the yard's vox. We walked back to the transport through a corridor lined with devotional plaques, praising reclamation as the highest form of service. The words blurred together. I could not remember when I had last felt anything resembling pride. Back in the barracks, I tried to clean my boots again. The runoff smell lingered no matter how much solvent I used. It had seeped into the material itself, become part of it. Like the work. Like me, that night. Lying on my bunk, I listened to the distant hum of the reclamation yards operating on a different shift. The sound carried through the hive's bones, a low, ceaseless vibration. Even in rest, the machine worked. Even in rest, the dead were being processed, repurposed, erased. I wondered, briefly, what part of me would be most useful when my time came. Muscle, bone, fat. I wondered if someone would recognize a scar and look away. Then I stopped wondering. Curiosity was another inefficiency, and the Imperium had no use for those. They did not announce the reassignment with ceremony. There was no speech about valor or necessity, no attempt to dress it in honor. The overseer simply read out new deployment coordinates and projected yields, his stylus clicking softly against the data slate as if marking an inventory transfer. The numbers were higher than anything we had been assigned before. The margin for loss, our loss, was listed as acceptable. That was how I knew we were being sent closer to the guns. The transport carried us upward this time, climbing through levels of the hive where the air grew thinner and the damage more recent. We passed through districts still smoldering, their fires not yet declared irrelevant. The vibrations of distant artillery thrummed through the hull, a deep, irregular pulse that settled into my bones. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been reduced to procedure. When we disembarked, the ground was mud, thick, sucking mud that clung to our boots and resisted every step. It was not natural earth. It was a slurry of pulverized masonry, chemical runoff, blood, and rainwater that burned faintly where it touched exposed skin. The sky above was a uniform gray, choked with smoke and drifting ash. Somewhere beyond the ruined structures ahead, guns fired in slow, deliberate patterns, each report followed by a distant echo and a tremor underfoot. "Fresh zone," the supervisor announced, his voice steady over the vox. "High recovery value. Maintain formation. Do not halt unless instructed." We moved forward in staggered lines, corpse, hooks held ready, eyes scanning the churned landscape for shapes that broke the pattern of debris. It did not take long. The first bodies lay scattered across a shallow crater, some intact, others reduced to fragments by the force of impact. Steam rose from torn flesh where it met the cold air. The smell was sharper here than in the rear zones, blood still wet, waste still warm. The metallic tang of propellant hanging thickly. As we began to work, the shelling resumed. There is a sound shells make when they pass overhead. A tearing whistle that seems to split the air itself. The first one landed a dozen meters away, throwing up a curtain of mud and fragments that rained down around us. I felt the impact in my chest more than my ears, a concussive thud that drove the breath from my lungs despite the respirator. For a moment, instinct screamed at me to run, to drop everything and throw myself into the nearest crater. The overseer's voice cut through the chaos. "Continue." So we did. I hooked a body by what was left of its shoulder and dragged it backward, my boots slipping in the mud. Another shell landed closer, and the ground heaved. Something struck my flak coat hard enough to spin me sideways. I went down on one knee, pain flaring along my ribs. My helm lamp flickered but stayed on. I did not check the damage. Checking would take time. Around me, others worked with the same grim focus. We moved between impacts, timing our efforts by the rhythm of the bombardment. When the guns paused, we pulled harder faster. When they fired, we crouched instinctively but did not stop. The supervisors remained upright, their personal shielding humming softly, data slates held steady even as dirt spattered their robes. A shell landed close enough to tear a body we were dragging into pieces. Limbs flew, one arm tumbling end over end through the air before landing at my feet. For a heartbeat I stared at it, the fingers still curled as if grasping for something. Then training took over. I logged the limb as partial mass and added it to my tally. Waste was inefficiency. The mud grew thicker as blood mixed into it, turning the ground slick and treacherous. Each step became an effort. My lungs burned, the respirator struggling to filter the increasingly fouled air. Sweat pooled beneath my coat, trapped by layers of grime. My muscles screamed with fatigue, but there was no space for that sensation anymore. Pain had become background noise, like the distant guns. Orders crackled constantly over the vox. Advance 5 meters. Recover and relocate. Do not engage. Always continue. The words blurred together, a litany as relentless as any prayer. Somewhere to my left, someone screamed, a sharp, high sound cut short by another impact. I did not look. Looking would have meant acknowledging that a living person had just become part of the quota. At one point, a shell shook loose a cluster of bodies from a collapsed wall above us. They tumbled down in a grotesque cascade, landing in a heap at our feet. The supervisor's eyes lit with something like satisfaction. Yield increase, he noted. Efficient. We set to work immediately. The bodies were still warm, their armor dented and torn, flesh exposed beneath. I dragged one free and felt resistance, not from debris, but from the corpse itself, its weight seeming to pull back against me. For a fleeting, irrational moment, I felt as if it did not want to be moved, as if it understood what awaited it in the reclamation yards. I shook the thought away and pulled harder. Fear, I realized then, had changed shape. It was no longer a spike that made my heart race or my hands tremble. It was a constant pressure, a dull ache that sat behind my eyes and in my chest. It did not motivate me to flee or fight. It simply existed, a companion to exhaustion and obedience. I could not imagine a time when it had not been there. As the shift wore on, the ground around us filled with new shapes even as we cleared old ones. Each shell created more work, each explosion both obstacle and opportunity. The supervisors adjusted quotas in real time, increasing expectations as the dead accumulated. There was no such thing as being finished. There was only keeping pace. By the time the recall order came, my arms felt like dead weight. My hands were numb inside my gloves, fingers moving on muscle memory alone. We loaded the final bodies onto the transport under sporadic fire, one last shell landing close enough to pepper the hull with fragments as the ramp closed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fresh death and churned mud. We slumped onto the benches, chests heaving, respirators hissing like exhausted animals. No one spoke. There was no relief, only the absence of immediate danger, which felt strangely hollow. As the transport pulled away, I looked back through a narrow viewport at the field we were leaving behind. Smoke drifted lazily over the craters, obscuring what remained. Somewhere out there, more bodies lay waiting, and more shells were already on their way. The work would never catch up. It was not meant to. In the barracks later, as I cleaned my gear with hands that barely responded, I noticed that my fear no longer flared at the memory of explosions. Instead, what lingered was a quieter dread, the certainty that this was now the expectation, that every future assignment would be closer, louder, deadlier, that the Imperium had learned how much it could demand from us and would demand more. I lay down without removing my respirator that night. The thought of taking it off, of breathing unfiltered air, felt wrong, unsafe, indulgent. I slept fitfully, dreams punctuated by distant impacts and the steady click of a data slate marking time. When I woke, my first thought was not of survival, but of quotas. The sickness announced itself quietly, the way all truly dangerous things do in the Imperium. There was no alarm, no quarantine siren, no sudden halt to operations. It began as an itch beneath the flak coat, an irritation I dismissed as chemical rash or dried blood ground too long into fabric. We were used to discomfort. Discomfort was expected. To complain about it would have marked me as inefficient. By the third shift after the forward deployment, the itch had become a burn. Redness bloomed along my ribs and under my arms, angry patches of skin that oozed when rubbed raw by constant movement. Others showed similar signs, dark veins standing out beneath pale flesh, sores forming where straps and seals pressed hardest. The smell of infection mingled with the usual stench of death and disinfectant, a sour note that lingered even after washing. Still, we worked. There was no directive to stop, and without directive, stopping was unthinkable. The Medicae inspections came eventually, brief and perfunctory. We were lined up outside a mobile treatment unit, respirators on, gear unremoved. A Medicare adept walked down the line with a scanner, waving it across exposed skin and armor seams. The device chimed and beeped, recording data I could not see. When it lingered too long over a particularly inflamed patch on my arm, I felt a flicker of something like hope. The adept moved on without comment. Behind him, an administratum functionary entered notes into a data slate. I caught a glimpse of the classification as he passed low, priority biological contamination. None, critical, monitor. The words felt heavier than any diagnosis. Non-critical meant non-urgent. Non-urgent meant ignorable. They issued us a salve, thin, acrid smelling, and a directive to increase personal hygiene where possible. There was no reduction in quotas. There was no adjustment in deployment zones. The sickness was treated as another environmental factor, like mud or smoke, to be worked through rather than addressed. As days passed, the rashes worsened. Some of us developed fevers that came and went, leaving behind a bone, deep exhaustion that sleep did not touch. Hands trembled more than before. Focus slipped. Small mistakes crept in, mislogged weights, dropped hooks, delayed responses to orders. The supervisors noticed immediately. The first punishment was administrative. A unit failed to meet quota by a narrow margin after a retrieval zone was temporarily sealed due to contamination levels. The supervisors called us into the barracks and announced disciplinary deductions. Ration allocations were reduced. Rest cycles shortened. The functionary read the penalties aloud in a monotone, his voice echoing off the bare walls. He did not mention the sickness. He did not need to. Responsibility in the Imperium always flows downward. The second punishment was exemplary. A body went missing. It was a partial, fragmented remains logged during a shelling, heavy shift. The numbers did not reconcile during processing. A discrepancy of mass flagged in the system, highlighted in red on the supervisor's data slate. He questioned us one by one, his tone calm, almost gentle, as if coaxing a confession from a child. No one knew what had happened. Or if someone did, they did not speak. The next day, a man from our unit, designation J04, was taken away for negligent loss of Imperial property. I watched him pack his few belongings with shaking hands, his face pale beneath the grime. He tried to joke as he passed me, a weak smile pulling at cracked lips. "Probably just reassignment," he said. "Rear zone, maybe." I did not answer. The words lodged in my throat like something rotten. He never returned. His bunk was cleared within the hour. His identifier disappeared from the roster, replaced by a blank line waiting to be filled. The quotas adjusted automatically, redistributing his expected output among the rest of us. His absence became a number. From then on, fear changed again. It was no longer just the fear of shells or collapse. It was the fear of being noticed for the wrong reason. Every action became a calculation. Move fast enough to meet quota, but not so fast that mistakes crept in. Log accurately, but do not draw attention by asking questions. Do not appear weak. Do not appear sick. I slept with my equipment on after that. Flat coat, respirator, gloves, all of it. Removing them felt like an admission of vulnerability. The sores beneath the armor worsened, fabric rubbing them raw until they wept. Sometimes I woke to the sensation of cloth sticking to skin, pulling away with a wet sound when I shifted. I learned not to flinch. Flinching wasted energy. Others fared worse. One woman developed a hacking cough that rattled inside her chest like loose metal. Another's hands swelled until his gloves split at the seams. They were still sent out on retrieval. They still met quota. The sickness did not excuse failure. It merely provided another metric by which we could be judged expendable. The supervisors increased their presence, their data slates ever watchful. They noted time lost to personal inefficiency and biological interference. Those phrases appeared more frequently in the end of shift reports. Alongside them came recommendations, reassignment, corrective action, replacement. The language was precise, bloodless. One night, during a rare lull, I found myself staring at my reflection in a cracked mirror bolted to the barracks wall. The lenses of my respirator hid my eyes, but I could see the outline of my face beneath, thinner than I remembered. The skin around my neck was mottled with red and purple, veins standing out starkly. I looked like something halfway between worker and corpse. For a moment, I wondered if this was the beginning of the end. If the sickness would eventually make me inefficient enough to be removed. The thought brought an unexpected sense of calm. To be taken away would mean release from quotas, from numbers, from the endless continuation. Then I remembered J's 04. Whatever removal meant, it was not mercy. The next shift we were short-handed again, another absence unexplained. The supervisor announced that productivity expectations would remain unchanged despite temporary personnel fluctuations. The message was clear: we were interchangeable, and the machine did not slow for missing parts. As we marched out toward the transport, rashes burning beneath our armor and lungs aching with every breath, I understood something fundamental. The sickness was not the problem. The sickness was the excuse. A way to thin us without paperwork, to let weakness self-select. Those who endured would continue until something else broke them. Those who did not would be replaced. I tightened my grip on the corpse, hook, and took my place in line. Survival was no longer about living, it was about remaining useful. The order came buried in routine, hidden among a dozen other procedural updates that scrolled across the supervisor's data slate at the start of shift. There was no emphasis placed on it, no pause to let its meaning settle. The Imperium rarely announces its moral transgressions with ceremony. It simply revises definitions. Reclassification of recoverable assets. The supervisor read aloud. Wounded personnel deemed non-viable for evacuation are to be processed under expedited reclamation protocols. No one spoke. A few of us exchanged brief glances through the dull lenses of our respirators, searching for confusion, outrage, anything. What we found instead was recognition. We had known this was coming, even if we had not admitted it to ourselves. The line between corpse and worker had been thinning for some time now. This was merely the final adjustment. We were deployed to a forward aid corridor, a shattered stretch of trenchwork and collapsed hab, walls where Medica teams had once triaged the wounded. The Medica were gone now, reassigned or killed or deemed inefficient. What remained were the injured they had left behind, lying on stretchers or the bare ground, tagged with colored strips of cloth that fluttered weakly in the hot, fouled air, red for urgent, yellow for delayed. black for something else. The black tags were new. They marked those who still breathed, but would not be treated. Those whose injuries required too much time, too many resources, too much attention. Those whose survival did not justify the cost. I had seen such calculations before, abstracted into numbers and charts. Seeing them tied to living, groaning bodies was different. Begin recovery, the supervisor ordered. His voice carried the same calm authority it always had. Log under mixed status assets. I approached the first one slowly. Corpse, hook held low. He lay on his back against a collapsed wall, one leg crushed beneath debris, the other twisted at an angle no joint should allow. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid motions. When he saw me, his eyes widened behind a mask cracked down the middle. "No," he rasped, "please, I'm alive. I can still." I hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for the supervisor's gaze to settle on me like a weight. "Asset is tagged," the supervisor said evenly. "Proceed." Training took over. Training always took over. I hooked the stretcher frame and began to drag him backward toward the collection point. He screamed then, a raw, animal sound that cut through the background noise of artillery and machinery. His hands clawed at the ground, at my boots, fingers slick with blood and dirt. "Don't," he begged. "Don't do this. Emperor, help me, don't." I did not answer. Answering would have meant acknowledging him as something other than cargo. I kept my eyes forward and pulled, muscles straining. The hook bit into the stretcher's metal with a familiar resistance. The sound of it scraping across broken ground matched the rhythm of my steps. Around me, others were doing the same. Some worked faster, heads down, as if speed might drown out the voices. Others moved with mechanical slowness, each motion deliberate, detached, the air filled with pleas, prayers, curses. Some called out to the Emperor. Some called out to mothers, to commanders, to anyone. A few went silent halfway through, slipping into shock or unconsciousness. Those were easier. One man grabbed my wrist as I passed, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes were fever bright, his face gray beneath streaks of soot. "You don't have to," he said hoarsely. "You don't have to do this." I looked at him then, really looked, at the torn uniform, the blood-soaked bandages, the way his breath rattled painfully in his chest. I saw myself reflected there, not as I was now, but as I would be soon enough, wounded, inefficient, reclassified. "I do," I said, though the words sounded distant in my own ears. "I do." His grip loosened as I pulled away. I did not look back to see when he stopped breathing. The supervisors logged everything. Time to recovery, weight of mixed status assets, compliance rates. They did not comment on the screaming. They did not note the expressions on our faces behind the masks. Those things were not relevant metrics. At the processing point, the wounded were placed with the dead. Some still moved weakly as the servitors approached, optics glowing as they assessed mass and composition. A few tried to speak, mouths opening and closing soundlessly as clamps descended. The machines did not pause. They had no protocols for mercy. I turned away as one was lifted, his arm twitching once before going still. The sound that followed, the crusher engaging, was indistinguishable from any other. The system did not differentiate. Something inside me finally broke then. Not loudly, not all at once. It was a quiet fracture, like a stress line spreading through stone. I realized I no longer felt horror in the way I once had. The screams hurt, yes, but they hurt like pressure hurts, not like a wound. My hands moved without conscious instruction. My breathing remained steady. I logged weights while standing beside people who had been alive moments before. That was when I understood the truth I had been circling for weeks. I was already dead, not biologically, not yet, but administratively. Spiritually, whatever part of me had once believed in the difference between living and dying had been eroded by quotas and classifications. I was a function now, not a person, and functions do not get to choose. That night, back in the barracks, no one spoke. The air was heavy with unvoiced things. Some sat staring at the wall. Others lay down without removing their gear, eyes open, respirators hissing softly. I lay on my bunk and listened to that sound, the steady mechanical breathing of a room full of the already condemned. When I closed my eyes, I heard the pleas again, layered over the crunch of machinery. They followed the rhythm of my pulse. I did not pray. I no longer knew who would be listening. I thought of the black tags fluttering in the air, marking those still alive as already lost. I wondered when such a tag would be tied to me, when my own breathing would be deemed inefficient. The thought did not frighten me, it only felt inevitable. It ended without drama. There was no final stand, no last words shouted into the smoke, no moment where time slowed and meaning crystallized. The Imperium rarely grants such indulgences. My end came the way everything else had in this assignment, as a consequence of scheduling, pressure, and acceptable loss margins. We were deployed to a sub-level manufactorum that had partially collapsed after sustained bombardment. The structure had once produced something vital, munitions, maybe, or components for something larger, but now it was a hollowed-out shell of girders and shattered assembly lines. The air inside was thick with dust and the tang of burned lubricants. Warning pictograms glowed faintly on fractured walls, their machine spirits still dutifully alerting no one in particular to dangers long ignored. Structural instability noted, the supervisor said as we entered, his voice echoing in the vast interior. Proceed with caution. Quota unchanged. I remember thinking distantly, that caution was a word with no practical application here. We moved through the wreckage in pairs, helm, lamps cutting cones of light through the haze. Bodies lay everywhere, workers, guards, unidentified personnel, crushed beneath fallen machinery or scattered where the blast wave had thrown them. Some were old, dry with dust and time. Others were recent, blood still tacky, flesh still pliable, fresh yield, valuable. My unit spread out, hooks scraping softly against metal as we worked. Somewhere above us, something groaned, a deep, metallic complaint that reverberated through the floor. Dust sifted down in thin streams. I logged it mentally and kept moving. We all did. Groaning structures were not unusual. Stopping every time one complained would have halved productivity. I was levering a body free from beneath a collapsed conveyor when the sound changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in pitch, the groan rising into something sharper. I looked up instinctively, helm lamp illuminating a web of cracks, spreading across a support column. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the supervisor hesitated, his data slate held mid-entry. Then the column failed. The collapse was not explosive. It was a chain reaction, one support giving way and transferring stress to the next. The ceiling came down in sections, slabs of ferrocrete and steel plunging into the space where we stood. I felt the impact before I heard it, a massive blow that drove me to the ground and knocked the breath from my lungs. My helm lamp shattered, plunging me into darkness lit only by distant, flickering emergency lumens. Something pinned my legs, something heavy. I tried to move and felt pain flare, bright and immediate, cutting through the numb exhaustion that had become my baseline. My respirator hissed as I sucked in air that tasted of dust and blood. The world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing and the distant shouts of others. Status check. The supervisor's voice crackled over the vox, strained but controlled. I tried to answer. My throat worked, but no sound came out at first. I swallowed dust and forced the words through. Unit member, I said, struggling to remember my own designation. Pinned, unable to extricate. There was a pause. In that pause, I understood everything. I understood the calculus already being performed, the projected effort required to free me, the risk of secondary collapse, the adjustment to quota if I were reclassified, all of it happening silently, efficiently, without malice. Stand by. The supervisor replied. I lay there, half buried beneath a tangle of metal and bodies, and waited. Around me, I could feel shapes pressed close, corpses, I realized dimly, dislodged by the collapse and piled atop me. Their weight was familiar, almost comforting. My hook lay just out of reach, its devotional script catching a glimmer of light. Time stretched. My breaths grew shorter, the respirator struggling as dust clogged its filters. Each inhale burned. My legs throbbed where they were pinned, sensation flickering in and out. I wondered briefly if the sickness had weakened me enough that I would not feel everything that came next. The thought was almost reassuring. The vox crackled again. Designation confirmed, the supervisor said. His tone was calm, professional. You are logged as unrecoverable under current conditions. I closed my eyes. Not in despair, but in acknowledgement. This was the moment everything had been leading toward, from the ink and seal to the quotas and the screams. I had been moving toward this entry in a ledger long before the ceiling fell. Recovery teams. The supervisor continued. Had unit members identifier to route. Estimated mass to be included in next processing cycle. There it was, the final reclassification. I exhaled slowly, dust rattling in my chest. The panic I might have expected did not come. Instead, there was a strange clarity. My duty as defined by the Imperium was complete. I had met quota in the only way left available to me. The weight above me shifted as others moved, boots scraping, hooks clinking. Someone stepped close, paused. For a moment, I thought they might try to free me despite orders. Then the steps moved on. Efficiency demanded it. Air grew scarce. The respirator's hiss became uneven, each breath a conscious effort. My vision darkened at the edges, emergency lumens blurring into halos. In that narrowing space, memories surfaced unbidden, not of childhood or happiness, but of procedure. The clerk's stamp. The first body pulled free. The numbers scrolling endlessly across a data slate. This was the sum of me. I felt pressure on my chest as another body settled, the weight increasing. My ribs creaked in protest. Pain flared, then dulled, as if my body were already preparing itself for processing. I wondered, with detached curiosity, how I would be classified. Crushed, mixed status, contaminated. The codes no longer mattered. My last thought was not of fear or regret, but of completion. There was a grim comfort in knowing I would not be wasted. My mass would be measured, my components sorted, my existence folded neatly back into the machine I had served. I would become lubricant, nutrient, raw material, something useful. As my breath finally failed, I imagined a clerk somewhere tapping a stylus against a data slate, my identifier flashing briefly before being marked complete. Another resource reclaimed. Another discrepancy resolved. The work would go on without me. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter?